Right, time to buy a graphics card, eh? What? Okay, what about 3080? eBay. Looks like I'm stuck on integrated graphics, aren't I?
Hello everyone, this is Daniel from the Cheap Chaps, and today I'm going to be looking at the Ryzen 5 3400G. That's an APU released a couple of years ago now in 2019. Uses the Zen Plus architecture, manufactured by Global Foundries on their 12nm process. It's got 4 cores, 8 threads, a base clock of 3.7 GHz, boost clock of 4.2 GHz, and finally it's got Vega 11 graphics, which we'll be testing today in a few games. Will it be any good? I've got no idea. That's the mystery we need to solve today. So let's split up and look for clues. Right, so before we get started, let's just have a quick rundown of the specs. So there's the 3400G, of course. That's running at stock speeds. There's 32 gig of RAM running at 3200 MHz. There's a Be Quiet Dark Rock Pro 3 CPU cooler, so there's not going to be any thermal throttling. All of those goodies are in a B550M Aorus Pro motherboard. That's about it. Let's go. So let's start things off with 7 Days to Die. In 1080p, had an average FPS of 39. The 1% lows were 21 FPS. At 900p, the average was 51 FPS and the 1% lows were 44. At 720p, the average was 71 and the 1% lows were 30. These were all tested on a mix of low to medium settings. And overall I found 900p to be the best one because it didn't look awful like 720p did, and it also didn't have the drops that 1080p had. But 1080p was playable if you're fine with those little drops. Doom Eternal. At 1080p the average FPS was 44 and the 1% lows were 33. Now that doesn't sound too bad, but the game was very stuttery and I didn't find it playable at all, to be honest. Moving on to 900p, average FPS was 57 and the 1% lows were 41 FPS. It was just about playable, but it still wasn't a great experience for this game. At 720p, the average was 80 FPS and the 1% lows were 54 FPS. That was all tested on the low preset. Now, Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War. Whew, what a mouthful. At 1080p, average FPS of 37, 1% lows of 5 FPS. 900p, the average FPS was 51, 1% lows of 6 FPS. And at 720p, the average FPS was 64 and the 1% lows were 4. This was all tested on low settings. Not that great. But it also wasn't quite as bad as what it sounds like with the 1% lows, at least for 900p and 720p. Moving on to Fortnite, a game that I had never played before this benchmark, but it's a popular game, so I decided to benchmark it. At 1080p, the average FPS was 72, the 1% lows were 52. At 900p, the average FPS was 81 and the 1% lows were 45. And at 720p, the average FPS was 130 and the 1% low was 76. This was all on low settings apart from viewing distance, which I think I put on medium. In my opinion, 900p or 720p is really the best there. Now, Grand Theft Auto 5. At 1080p, the average FPS was 77. The 1% lows were 58. Very good, brilliant. 900p, average FPS 86. The 1% lows were 71. And at 720p, the average FPS was 91 and the 1% lows were 72 FPS. These were all tested on low/medium settings, bit of a mix. And 1080p, great in that game. I don't see why you'd play on any lower resolution than that. Okay, Black Mesa is the next game. At 1080p, 91 FPS average, 1% lows of 48 FPS. At 900p, 135 FPS and 1% lows of 81. And at 720p, average FPS 180 and 1% lows of 99. This was on the medium preset, and I thought 1080p was great. But if you don't want any dips below 60 at all, then 900p is for you. And the final game I'm going to be testing is Civ VI. At 1080p, I had an average of 54 FPS and 1% lows of 27 FPS. It would stutter a lot when panning the camera about, so I don't think I would play at 1080p in this game, at least not on the medium settings I used. 900p, average FPS of 85 and 1% lows of 63 FPS. 720p, average 103 FPS, 1% lows of 72 FPS. These were all tested on the medium preset, and I think 900p was the sweet spot. It didn't have the weird stuttering issue whenever I panned the camera. Okay, so let's have a look at the average FPS by resolution when taking all games into account and making an average across them. So at 1080p I had an average of 59.1 FPS and 1% lows of 34.9 FPS. At 900p I had 78 FPS on average and 1% lows of 50.1. At 720p I had 102.7 FPS on average and 1% lows of 58.1 FPS. Okay, so say you've got a 3400G, which resolution should you play at? Well, as you can imagine, it varies based on game. Grand Theft Auto 5 and Black Mesa, for example, ran really well at 1080p, and others played well at 900p and would be more sensible to play at that resolution. I don't really think I'd play at 720p for any of these games, but if you're fine with that drop off in visual quality and just want more FPS, then go for it. On the subject of the 3400G, there's something about this product that I don't like, and that's the name. As I mentioned earlier, the 3400G is Zen Plus based, and it's manufactured on GlobalFoundries' 12nm process. That's unlike the rest of the Ryzen 3000 series lineup, which is Zen 2 based, and it uses the TM7C 7nm process, and both those things brought huge improvements to Ryzen CPUs. So in essence, I think AMD marketing this as a 3000 series product is wrong. I think it's deceptive marketing because this APU clearly belongs in the 2000 series. But what do you think? You can leave a comment below and I'll definitely listen. So what's the verdict? Can you play games on the Ryzen 5 3400G? Yeah, definitely. Some of them really well. As long as you're fine with turning down the settings a little bit and not playing at a crazy resolution, the 3400G can definitely be used to play games. Be it just as a stopgap measure before you get a new graphics card, or maybe you just don't want a dedicated graphics card at all. It's definitely usable. And I think that just about covers it. Yes, you can game on a 3400G. So if you want to see more videos like this, you know what to do. And I know you want to see more videos like this. Oh yes, yes, I can see that look on your face, and I know you want to see more videos like this. Okay, I'm going to stop.